Good evening. Welcome to the League of Women Voters of Montana event in partnership with the Brennan Center for Justice. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that provides voter services and education. The Brennan Center is a nonpartisan law and policy institute affiliated with New York University School of Law. I am Nancy Leifer, president of the League of Women Voters of Montana, and your moderator for today's program. We'll be recording this program so that it will be available to view for those who are unable to be with us tonight. We're here this evening to examine the possibility of Montana gaining a second seat in the U.S. House of Representatives. Should this happen, Montana's bipartisan Redistricting Commission will be tasked with fairly dividing the state into 2 congressional districts, as well as determining state legislative districts. Redistricting, however, has caused some controversy in other states, and so we will also be exploring how these changes may impact Montana and its residents. To get some guidance on this, we are happy to welcome Dr. Peter Miller. He is a uniquely qualified individual for this particular task, as he grew up in Billings, Montana. And he is currently a researcher on the democracy team at the Brennan Center in New York, where he focuses on redistricting, voting, and education, and elections. After Dr. Miller's presentation about Montana, 3 members of Montana's 5-member Districting and Apportionment Commission will join us for a panel discussion about what might be ahead for our state. Before we begin, I just want to invite all of you who are listening to share your questions for the panel. You can type them into the Q&A box during Dr. Miller's presentation. Dr. Miller and the members of the Montana Districting Commission will answer as many questions as they can following the presentation. And if you would like more information about each of our speakers, brief biographies can be found on the Montana League website. And now, without further ado, I'll turn the program over to Dr. Peter Miller.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Nancy. It's a delight to be able to speak to the League of Women Voters again. This has turned into something of a tradition, and I'm delighted that it's able to continue even under the conditions of the pandemic. I'm also delighted to join 3 of the members of the Montana Redistricting Commission, and thankful that they're here and able to share their time and wisdom when we get to the question and answer period and are able to talk about and respond to your questions. My plan is to have some slides, some commentary from me. Those prepared remarks will then end and we'll start our questions. So without further ado, I'm going to disappear and you'll probably see the slides. I'll be narrating in the background and hopefully all goes well. Let's see. So we should be seeing the first slide here, and this is just an introductory material. Of course, the motivating reason for this talk is the potential for Montana to gain a second congressional seat. I'm going to be talking about just apportionment and redistricting generally, give an overview of the redistricting process, who draws the lines in the various states, the various criteria that are in place to govern this process, and then delve into a little more detail about redistricting in Montana. And then I'll conclude with just a couple of comments as your public comment hearings, rather, to solicit feedback from the public about the configuration of legislative districts in Montana and the potential for a second district at the congressional level from Montana. The first point that I just want to raise is that the 2020 redistricting process is going to be governed by the data that's collected in the 2020 census cycle. Those data then are informed, or do inform what's called the apportionment process. The Census Bureau will then calculate the number of seats that each state will have in the U.S. House of Representatives. And the question, of course, is whether Montana will get a second district after the 2020 census is finalized. data that's put together from a group, Election Data Services based in Virginia, seems to suggest that Montana will get a second district. Though I must emphasize here that the margin in some of these estimates is very small, on the order of about 2,000 people. The Election Data Services puts together a number of different estimates of population growth. And what we can see from this bottom line in this table is that all of these models are converging with that Montana will get a second district. If we take the population of Montana as it's estimated to be in 2019, this is the first time in which we can see that Montana will get a second district based on the population as it is. If we start estimating population growth patterns as to what the population of the state might be at the conclusion of the 2020 census, we start to get into some statistical and demographic estimation methods. But even here, these models, at least in the short term, have predicted that Montana would get a second district since 2016. If we take a longer view and estimate population growth from 2010, then it's a little more limited, but we still see, at least in data since 2018, that Montana would get a second district. The point here that's also important to remember, though, is that Montana is scheduled, if these estimates are correct, to get either the 434th or 435th, which is to say the second to last or the last seat in the US House. So while things are looking promising for Montana to get a second district, it is by no means certain. And this is probably as good point as any to remind anyone who's listening and to tell your friends, if you haven't already, you might want to complete your census form. It's very easy to do, very quick to do online or by mail. And these data, of course, will inform the congressional apportionment across the country into the decade following the 2020 census. Let me give you a sense of, once the census data is collected and that process is complete, who actually draws the lines and actually does the redistricting. The general process, as you can see from this figure, is that most of the redistricting that's done is actually done by state legislatures. So state legislatures will draw legislative districts and congressional districts. Montana is exceptional, with a number of other states that you can see highlighted here, in that Montana has a appointed commission that actually draws the legislative and congressional districts. As you can see, these commissions tend to be clustered in the Western United States. Michigan and New Jersey are exceptions that we can talk about a little bit in the Q&A if people are interested. The point here is that redistricting in the Western United States has a starkly different character than redistricting elsewhere in the country, in part because of the prevalence of these commissions that serve to draw these districts as a means of separation between the legislature and the act of redistricting. When did these commissions come into play? Of course, the redistricting revolution itself is generated as a result of the Supreme Court case in Baker versus Carr in the early 1960s, and has led through a series of other Supreme Court cases up to the modern day. When we look at when states have actually adopted these commissions, however, a pattern comes into play. We can see that New Jersey and Hawaii were the first states to adopt a commission in the late 1960s. Montana, of course, adopts their commission with the ratification of the state constitution in 1972, and then other states follow through, as you can see from this figure. The innovation of what's these so-called independent redistricting commissions really dates from the Arizona Commission, which was passed by a voter-approved initiative in 2000, and then the California model takes the same principle of an independent commission, tweaks the structure of the commission itself, and California adopts their commission in a two-step process in 2008 and 2010. The independent commissions in Michigan and Colorado, largely based on the California model, were adopted in the 2018 election. So if we look at the gradual increase of separation between the legislature and the act of redistricting, you can see that Montana is an early mover in this phase, in the sense that they adopted a commission much earlier than other states. Yet the innovation of this concept of an independent redistricting commission, by which we mean a commission that is independent of the legislature in terms of selection, they're free to draw the maps as they see fit, and those maps are not subject to approval by some other body, that you see that the innovation of these redistricting commissions as an independent body really dates from the last 20 years at best. Let's turn to the redistricting process in Montana in particular. The Montana Constitution stipulates a number of standards for the redistricting process as it must be governed. As you can see, the Montana Constitution mandates that districts shall be compact and contiguous territory, and that districts shall be nearly as equal in population as is practicable. There is a 90-day deadline to produce congressional maps after the census data is released to the states. The Montana Constitution was amended as a result of a ballot measure in 1984 to remove the phase by which the legislature could comment on the congressional maps before it was enacted. However, that requirement remains in place for the legislative maps. So the legislative maps will be submitted to a regular session of the legislature and for their comment. The commission has the ability to incorporate the comment from the legislature as they see fit, and then the maps are ratified in a final approval vote from the commission. In the event that Montana has a second congressional district, the congressional redistricting process will be completed in time for the 2022 elections, while legislative maps will only become effective in the 2024 elections. So there's a bit of a lag with legislative redistricting as opposed to congressional redistricting in the event that it takes place in Montana. Montana statutes have also added some detail into the standards that govern the redistricting process in the state. Here you can see the reference to the specific section of the Montana Code annotated that provides a little more detail to the redistricting process. For example, the Montana Code stipulates that a 1% population deviation is permitted, while the Constitution, of course, leaves that point somewhat open. The Montana statutes also stipulate that counties and cities must be kept whole if possible, that sort of diagonal contiguity is not permitted. It establishes a mathematical formula to estimate the compactness of a district, and it stipulates that districts cannot be drawn to advantage of party incumbent and that political data cannot be used in the drawing of these districts. However, this section of the Montana Code was initially adopted in the 2000 legislative cycle. A separate but related section of the Montana Code was challenged in a lawsuit that ultimately was challenging the independence of the Montana Redistricting Commission. The courts found that the commission itself was able to be independent of the legislature. And while this section of the Montana Code has not been addressed directly by a court, related sections have been and have been found unconstitutional. So at least in the opinion of two authors of a recent law review article that appeared in the University of Montana Law Review, this section of the Montana Code is likely unconstitutional. Perhaps a good point to pause here and say one of the authors of this article is also a former Associate Justice in the Montana Supreme Court, and as it happens, a former chair of the Redistricting Commission. So I assign a little more value to his opinion than I might otherwise, but at least this section exists on the books. Whether or not it's adhered to by the commission is, of course, up to the commissioners as they engage in their work. So once the redistricting process is complete, what sort of assessments can be made from a social science perspective about the effects of redistricting? One key point here is that most of the research that's conducted about redistricting tends to take place at the congressional level, in part because it's easier to collect data, it's easier to make generalizable statements, and for the most part, academics just assume that legislative districts sort of behave in the same fashion. There are, of course, lots of examples of academic studies that focus only on legislative redistricting, but for the most part, congressional districting takes the lion's share of the attention. What we can observe from the literature is that redistricting actually improves representation and responsiveness. This dates back, of course, to the historical notion of these rotten or pocket boroughs in the United Kingdom, where you had very small districts that were under, say, the sway of a given landowner, and that redistricting exists to, in a sense, allocate political power evenly across a country. So in the United States, we redistrict electoral districts precisely for the purpose to account for population shifts. If we didn't do that, we would end up with this skewed representation of various interests, as we observed in the US Congress prior to the development of the Baker versus Carr cases and its successive cases. So in a sense, redistricting exists to increase representation and the responsiveness of an electoral body. Redistricting, at least as far as research has shown, suggests that it has no effect on polarization. This we can observe because while the US House has become more polarized over time, the US Senate has also become polarized over time, and the US Senate is not subject to redistricting. One key point, however, is that one area in which redistricting can have a significant effect on the experience of a typical constituent is that redistricting can reduce turnout by disrupting recognition of a constituent and their incumbent member of a legislature. And so this is fairly obvious if we think of, say, an area of a county that is carved out of an old district. The constituents in that area need to then remind themselves who their constituent in Congress is and who that person is when they end up voting in the next election. As a consequence, a lot of research has shown that these carved out areas have lower turnout, and it's supposed that it's because the people in these areas have a more difficult time identifying who their incumbent member of Congress is and are therefore less likely to vote. This is one area in which redistricting can have a significant and observable effect on how people engage in electoral campaigns. Oftentimes, redistricting and gerrymandering, or if we want to be precise, gerrymandering, it is after all named after the former Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry, are often conflated as concepts. And gerrymandering, or gerrymandering, however you want to pronounce it, can be done on the basis of race, in the sense that you can draw a district with the precise intent to, say, deny a minority population the ability to elect a representative of their choice. You can engage in districting in such a way that one party is disadvantaged and another party is advantaged. This often tends to be the case in states where a single party controls the process by controlling a majority in both legislative chambers and the governor's office in most instances. You can also have a districting plan that systematically advantages incumbents. A good example of this is the 2000 district plan that was passed in California, where Democrats and Republicans came together to protect incumbents. And the famous example here is that in the course of the decade of the 2000s, only one member of the congressional delegation from California was defeated, despite pretty wide swings in sentiment in the elections in the 2000 decade. If we take a longer view of the redistricting and the partisan advantage perspective, we can see there's a small Democratic bias in the 70s and 80s, perhaps reflective of the longstanding Democratic majority that was in place in the US House for decades in the post-war era. There's a neat natural experiment when the Republicans in Texas are able to win a majority in the legislature, and they announce a mid-decade redistricting cycle, they pick up seats in the congressional delegation in Texas as a neat natural experiment, as to say, when no other state is doing this and yet Texas makes this unprecedented move. A similar attempt following Texas was attempted in Colorado, but was ultimately stymied in the courts. One point here is, of course, the goal that political parties have is, of course, adopting policies that they find consistent with their values and perspectives. And so redistricting can be used in a strategic manner as a method by which you can assure that your party will have a majority and they're therefore able to produce policies that your party favors, whether Democratic or Republican. But then another facet of this process is that, of course, if a party controls the process on their own, out-of-party members of either the legislature or Congress tend to see more mangled districts, meaning that as a result of redistricting, an out-of-power representative tends to have a district that bears little or less resemblance to the district as it existed prior to the redistricting process. Let me give you an example of a partisan gerrymander. What you're seeing here are an arrangement of districts in the Pennsylvania congressional map as it was drawn and approved by the Pennsylvania legislature in 2011. The first line, the sort of red line, shows you for an increasing share of the Democratic vote, the vote share at the statewide basis cast for a Democratic candidate, how many seats the Democratic Party might be expected to win. It might be difficult to interpret this, but the important point here is that under the plan as it existed in 2012 to 2016, the Democrats were winning about 45% of the vote, and yet were locked in to about less than 40% of the seats, 5 to be precise. A challenge in the Pennsylvania State Supreme Court, actually brought by the League of Women Voters in the state, overturned this congressional map. And as a result, the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania drew the map themselves. And here we have an opportunity to observe court intervention into partisan gerrymandering. The neat result here is that after the Supreme Court redrew the map, we had the 2018 midterm election, and you see the Democratic Party winning about 53% of the vote and winning 9 of the 18 congressional districts. In essence, here is an illustration of how court intervention into the gerrymandering process can result in more fair outcomes for a party. And I need to emphasize here that while I'm talking about a map that was originally drawn by the Republicans in Pennsylvania, the Democratic Party also engages in this practice from time to time. One reason why we focus so much on Republican gerrymander is in part because of the historically high level of success that the Republican Party had in the 2010 and 2012 elections, given that that sort of set the stage for the redistricting process that proceeded over the last decade. It's nothing about an individual party. Both parties engage in these behaviors if they have the chance. So let me talk a little bit about redistricting commissions and the effects that we can observe from those institutions when they're put in place. The first and perhaps easiest to demonstrate is that commissions increase competition in the sense that they make the victory margin of an eventual office holder smaller. This is in a sense that, as was brought up in a previous hearing where political scientists from across the state observed, when you have competitive elections, there is an incentive for an office holder to pay more attention to the concerns and preferences of his or her constituents. Redistricting commissions provide that in the sense that they draw districts where incumbents are not assured of re-election and therefore have to be catering to the interests and preferences of their constituents. There is some evidence, at least based out of California, that commissions are better able to respect communities of interest in the sense that as a result of the process by which commissions engage in public interface and solicit input and feedback from the public, they are better able to draw districts that are consistent with what people think of as their community of interest in terms of a group of people to delineate by a district. There is at least the claim that commissions reduce some of the conflicts of interest that might be inherent in the redistricting process. However, these commissions themselves may also be snared in the political process. Bruce Kane, in his 2012 article in the Yale Law Journal, for example, focuses on the commission in Arizona, where there was a controversy in between the legislature at the time and the commission that resulted in a considerable amount of friction between these two institutions and a number of court cases, one of which was a 2015 Supreme Court case where a 5-4 majority of this court agreed that redistricting commissions are constitutional, at least according to the plain text of the U.S. Constitution's election clause, wherein a majority of the court found that when the elections clause refers to a legislature, that also provides for things like direct democracy, given that the commission in question in Arizona was passed by approval of a ballot measure referred to the people in 2000. My own research in this area also seems to suggest that commissions are able to produce timely maps. So a 90-day deadline to produce a map is perhaps no problem for example, commission in Idaho, but it may be a problem for a legislature given the various interests that a legislature has to provide for in a typical legislative session. They're also able to largely avoid litigation. In this particular article, my colleague and I make the observation that a congressional map drawn by a commission has not yet been overturned by a court. There have been some court modifications made to legislative maps drawn by commissions, but at least at the congressional level, a commission map thus far has survived a legal challenge. And will, of course, in the 2020 redistricting cycle, this may become an issue given the proliferation of more and more states adopting some form of a commission process. Let me tell you a little bit about the past in Montana. As I'm sure everyone knows, at least if not looking at this slide, Montana achieved statehood in 1889. And from 1890 to 1910, Montana had one at-large district, in a sense the same setup that is present today. From 1912 to 1916, Montana had two at-large districts, which means the entire state is a single district, yet they elect two representatives from the same district. From between 1918 and 1990, Montana is split into two districts, largely following an east-west divide in the state. Maps of these districts are made available from a delightful database of congressional maps produced by scholars at the University of California, Los Angeles. You can actually go back and look at congressional districts as they have evolved from the first congressional session right after the ratification of the Constitution. It is a delightful resource if you want to get a sense of what districts have looked like in the scope of time. And as I'm sure everyone knows, as a result of the 1990 apportionment process, Montana lost one seat, and since 1992 to at least 2020, Montana has had a single at-large district. Of course, this may change after the 2020 census is complete. So let me show you a map of what these districts look like. What you can see here is a map that existed as dividing the congressional districts in Montana as it existed, as was in place between 1918 and 1964. And you can see the district there, and identified by the dark black line, follows county borders. And so you can see Bozeman and Gallatin County is in the western district. The district sort of snakes in a northwest direction up to dividing between Flathead and Glacier counties. So here's the sort of the first example of a division in Montana, and following roughly the Rocky Mountains as they divide the state. And it's important here to note that the border of the congressional district follows county lines. And I'll return to this point in a moment. As we move forward into the 1960s and the beginning of 1970s, the district changes a little bit, but you can still see it's roughly east-west. The southern border has now moved to Park County. The northern border has moved over to between Liberty and Hill County. Cascade County and Choteau County remain in the eastern district, but in essence, the districts remain an east-west divide between the state, within the state, excuse me. As we move into the 70s, that model remains. There's some modifications to the district with the configuration of whole counties that move from one district to the other. But again, we're looking at counties as counties, not as individual units. So that it's fairly easy in part to move, say, a whole county rather than, say, dividing a county when needed to. And then, of course, here's the final configuration of districts as they existed in the into the 1980s and terminating at the end of the 1980 cycle, or right before the conclusion of the 1990 census. And so here, again, you can see a fairly standard approach by now. You can probably understand that the line drawers at this point probably thought that they were beholden to the force of history and maintain districts as they were drawn in an east-west pattern with looking at whole counties. Let me show you just a sense of how things have performed over time. It's probably no surprise to anyone who's paid attention to politics in Montana that the district as it existed in the western part of the state tended to be more Democratic. You can see by this figure that Democrats are winning about 57, 58% of the vote on average between 1919 and 1988. And the district in the east, the second district, tended to favor Republicans. So the Democratic vote share here is lower, it's about 47, 48%. So on average, a Democrat was elected in the western district and a Republican was elected in the eastern district. There are, of course, exceptions to this rule, and I'll make just a couple of observations. One of the Republicans that was elected in the western district in 1940 was Jeanette Rankin. A Democrat who was elected in the eastern district in the 70s was John Melcher. But in general, you can see that the two districts sort of broke along partisan lines. So the natural question is, in event that Montana receives a second congressional district, can we just go back to the districts as they were drawn in the 1980s as a means to simplify the congressional redistricting process? And here, I'm afraid to say I have bad news. I don't think that the map as they were drawn in the 1980s would pass constitutional muster, in part because a Supreme Court case out of New Jersey came into play in the 1980s where the Supreme Court ruled that there is no de minimis standard for population equality. In effect, the court has found that a strict population equality at the congressional level is required. So a difference of one person could potentially be the cause for a court case to ultimately throw out the map. The figure that I'm showing you here shows population growth in the counties since the 2010 census. This is based on 2010 to the most recent population estimates we've got in 2018 from the American Community Survey. What might be obvious is that you can see that the population growth in the western portion of the state has increased far beyond the population growth in the eastern districts. In fact, if anything, the population has been declining in eastern Montana and growing in western Montana. Gallatin County is the largest and fastest growing county in the state. It grows by about 17% since the 2010 census. While we see some counties in the eastern portion of the state, Richland, Webo, Prairie, and Carter, also have relatively high growth rates. It's important to note that these counties they began with a very small population base to begin with. And so the ultimate cause of this is that you're ending up with more growth in the west, less growth in the eastern part of the state. And so as a consequence, if we were to adopt the maps that were drawn in the 1980s, the population and inequality between those districts would be roughly 50,000 people. And this would be infeasible from at least a legal perspective, or grounds for a challenge on population equality and 14th Amendment protections. So let me just turn to the legislative maps briefly. Montana, as I'm sure everyone knows, as I mentioned earlier, rewrote their state constitution in 1972. And one impetus for this was observing the apportionment cases that were coming out of other states in the preceding decade. And the important point here is that in these reapportionment cases, while Montana was not party to those cases or covered by the decision as it was implemented, it was apparent that a malapportionment, in the sense of population inequalities across legislative districts, was rampant in Montana prior to the ratification of the 1972 Constitution. So for example, the Montana Senate was more malapportioned than 13 of the 15 states that were included in the 1964 reapportionment cases. And so as a consequence, there's of course an obvious reason to think, well, Montana clearly needs to change how redistricting is done. And one solution here is the adoption of both the 1972 Constitution and the Reapportionment Commission as it exists today. When we look at the idea of partisan bias in these legislative maps, there are in effect three standard measures in the academic literature. The first is this efficiency gap, which measures the differential in wasted votes as an idea that a party that is wasting more of their votes is disadvantaged in a current plan. This was innovated to describe some of the partisan advantage that was inherent, at least in the Wisconsin legislative maps that were drawn after the 2010 reapportionment cycle. Partisan symmetry is an older indicator. It roughly works on the same principle. What it's looking at is the degree to which both parties at a same share of the vote would get the same share of the seats. So let's imagine one party gets 48% of the vote and 20% of the seats. That might strike us as unfair. However, if the other party also gets 48% of the vote and 20% of the seats, then we can say the map is symmetric. Both parties are being treated equally. As that quantity deviates one way or the other, we can then see that the map is increasingly asymmetric, in the sense that one party is advantaged and the other one is disadvantaged. A third indicator is the difference between the mean and median vote. So you could take, say, the average Republican, compare that to the median Republican, and see how those values are different from each other. That skew between these two values will give us one indication of the way in which the map is advantaging or disadvantaging a given party. With that, all that being said, you can see here the measures of the efficiency gap, partisan symmetry, and mean median vote differences in Montana legislative elections since 1974. And of course, I'm only looking at years that end in 4 because these are the years in which immediately after the reapportionment process and redistricting process. And so it's argued that this is the best example of the effects of the map as opposed to the effects of say, campaigns or the larger political context. The good news here is that for the most part, we don't see much in the way of partisan bias in Montana legislative districts. The 1990 cycle is notable here in the sense that we might see that the efficiency gap is up to about 6% in favor of Republicans. That being said, the folks that designed the efficiency gap even stipulate that a measure below 7% is probably indicative of mixed results or no systematic advantage. So even at the high watermark in Montana history, we don't see anything that rises to the level that might be concerning in terms of partisan bias. Let me now just make a couple of comments about tribal representation in Montana, as of course, minority representation is an important element of redistricting and redistricting litigation. Montana's largest racial minority are Native Americans. And here you can see a map of the census tracts in the state with indications of the reservations in the state and a population of natives in each census tract. Let's imagine, for the sake of simplicity, that Montana is found to have 1 million people as a result of the census, exactly 1 million. Then from there, we can estimate that the ideal population of a given legislative district will be 10,000 people, or 1 million divided by 100. Once we have that ideal population level, then we can start thinking about the configuration of the state into 100 pieces that form legislative districts. And at this point, we might be wondering, is it possible to draw one or more districts with a majority of members of native tribes? This map is, of course, not indicative of what the ultimate legislative districts might look like, but it might give you a sense of the areas in which it might be possible to draw districts with a majority of a minority population. One element that came out of my research in the last redistricting cycle was when I was speaking to members of the legislature in Oregon, they explicitly said that one of their objectives was identify areas of the state in which native populations lived in a large enough and compact enough population that it was feasible to draw a district, and then they drew those districts first, and then the surrounding districts around them. Excuse me. Let me just make a couple of comments about the use of computers in the redistricting process. Computers have been used in redistricting since the 1960s in roughly rudimentary manner. And yet they've been existing almost in the background as a sort of data processing and data management element. The advent of sophisticated mapping software appears to have accelerated the shift away from compact districts rather than start that trend. Interest groups have been drawing their own maps as a means of collecting their influence since the 1990s. And while computing power has increased substantially, the software that actually required to draw these maps has become prohibitively expensive and is quite complex in terms of training. There is one platform that's devised by folks at, in Massachusetts at Tufts. Districtor is fairly intuitive to use. And actually, some colleagues and I have just recently, we've developed an algorithm to do a wholly computer-based redistricting. And this article has just been accepted for publication in a peer-reviewed journal. So we're, one, quite delighted about that. And two, it gives me a tool by which I've been able to draw 507 simulated maps of 2 congressional districts in the state of Montana, just to give you a sense of what these solutions might look like. This map shows you the state of Montana divided into block groups and the likelihood of any given block group being drawn into the western district of the state, excuse me, or to be more precise, a district that also includes Lincoln County. And so what I did is just go through and code all of the block groups in the state. If they're in a district with Lincoln County, they're considered in the western district. If they're not, they're considered in the eastern district. And what you can see is that the plurality of solutions seem to follow a roughly east-west divide in the state, like has been done in the past. Though there is some deviation. So for example, in some maps, as you might be able to see from the gradation of the shade, Phillips County has been included with Lincoln County in a couple of solutions. So let me walk you through just a couple of these alternative maps to give you a flavor for the universe of potential outcomes that we might be looking at. First is a Plan 122 that was devised in this algorithm. This was simply just the 122nd map that was produced by this algorithm. And here you can see a rough approximation of what we observed in earlier rounds of redistricting. The east-west divide of the state, Missoula in the western district, Billings and Yellowstone County in the eastern district, and roughly follows the front range of the Rocky Mountains. There are, of course, wild alternatives. Here in Plan 406, as I was going through these and was initially surprised to see such a solution, seems to draw the exterior or border regions of the state compared to the interior of the state. This is, of course, not to mean that this is a viable, feasible, or palatable plan, but rather just to give folks a sense of different ways in which we can draw districts that are both contiguous and population balanced. I should specify that the algorithm was designed to draw districts that are population balanced within 1/2 of 1%, or about 2,000 people. So while these are not strictly equal, it wouldn't be too difficult to draw districts that would be population balanced at a strict level. And the last alternative is to look at a district that might take a north-south orientation to a second district, rather than the east-west district that has been in position in the past. Of course, again, this may be laughed out of any public comment hearing, but the important part here is that it starts a conversation. And it also provides a space for the public to weigh in on the process, as it seems to be much easier for the public to say, here's what I don't like about a plan, rather than propose, here's what I have in mind. It seems much easier for people to respond to a proposed map rather than innovate one themselves. So let me just wrap up with a couple of tips as we're commenting on the public comment process. Of course, the commission itself will be taking public comment as they're developing proposals for the legislative and potentially congressional maps. Please keep in touch with their website to see what their hearing schedule looks like. Some of my research actually looked at the 2011 to 2012 redistricting cycle, where I traveled around the country and attended these public comment hearings, and then looked back at the final maps that were drawn in a variety of states to try and distill some lessons about what it makes for an effective piece of comment. One overarching finding in this research was that the smaller an area involved in a comment, the more likely it is to be accepted. So in the sense that a neighborhood is easy to accommodate, a group of counties is probably difficult to accommodate. Also, in addition to asserting what you would like to happen, explain why it's important to you, why it is, what do you think about is your community? What is it about this place that makes you interested, and to the point that you're willing to participate in the process? It's also important to recognize what you're willing to give up, because a lot of people seem to suggest that while redistricting is a conflict of values, you can't always satisfy every criteria in every situation. So it's always helpful for folks to say, well, I would prefer that this neighborhood be included in my district, and I'm willing to sacrifice a degree of compactness or competition. And then, of course, one overarching theme that came out of my discussions with legislators and members of commissions at the time was that they could easily identify so-called astroturf testimony, where people are just rehashing comments from rote memory. And they had said it was pretty easy to dismiss that sort of stuff. So if you have a comment and you want to make sure that you and your neighbors express the same concept, you may just want to innovate a unique way to deliver that comment to the redistricting authorities, whether in Montana or elsewhere. With that, I'm going to stop my prepared remarks. I'm going to take a glass of water, and I'm going to welcome everybody to the Q&A session of this discussion, and welcome the members of the Montana Commission to join our conversation. So I hope this was informative. Thank you very much, and looking forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Miller, for your thorough explanation of the many considerations before us. Joining us now to discuss all of this are 3 members of the 5-member Montana Districting and Apportionment Commission. I'd like to introduce to you our 3 commissioners who are with us this evening. Jeff Essman, appointed by the Montana Senate Republican Majority Leader. Good evening, Jeff.
Thank you for the invitation, Nancy.
Thank you for coming. Joe Lamson, appointed by the Montana Senate Democratic Minority Leader. Joe, thank you for joining us this evening.
Yes, and what a great presentation, Peter.
Thank you. And Sheila Stearns, appointed by the Montana Supreme Court to be the nonpartisan chair of the commission. Commissioner Stearns is recovering from a bout of laryngitis, so she may be communicating and commenting a little bit less than usual this evening. Good evening, Sheila. All righty. Well, welcome to you all. We have some questions, so we can get started in just a minute. But before we do, I'd just like to send out a reminder to all of you who are here as attendees in the webinar that you can send in a question by putting it into the Q&A box, which is down on the bottom of your screen. And we will pass those on and get those answered by our assembled panel of commissioners and Peter, our expert on redistricting. So thank you. I'd like to start with a question that came in from the very first question that came in. And that I think I would ask of Peter probably for the moment. Why is the legislative districting process in Montana delayed until 2024, whereas the congressional redistricting takes place in 2022?
It's an interesting quirk of Montana state law. The requirement, and of course the commissioners can correct me if I'm wrong on this one, is that the legislative maps must formally be presented to a regular session of the legislature. And while Montana's legislature only meets for a 90-day session in odd numbered years, in effect that mandates that the first opportunity to present the map will be the opening days of the 2023 legislative session. And then the consequence would be that the first election after that would be the 2024 primary elections. So it's a quirk of state law that delays the process for the legislative districting in Montana a bit. That requirement was eliminated in a constitutional amendment in 1984, so the congressional maps can be put in place a bit faster than the legislative.
Anybody like, yes, go ahead. Go ahead, Joe.
No, that's exactly right. It's what we have in our Constitution.
The next question I'd like to ask, and perhaps I'll direct this one again to Peter, is how are non-citizens counted in the redistricting process?
Yeah, so that's a good question too. The apportionment process just is a head count of everyone in the state. And so the census is designed to count everyone. The current standards seem to suggest that the total population is counted in terms of apportionment for various legislative and congressional districts. There was a Supreme Court case that was argued out of Texas to permit other apportionment bases to be used. The Supreme Court said that while total population is acceptable, they sort of dodge the issue as to some of these other denominators. So what we might see in this next cycle, is an effort to return to that question and have a court weigh in on the acceptable basis for apportionment. We'll just have to wait and see what cases emerge from the states.
And I'd like to do a follow-up question on that. When will we know whether we will have a second congressional representative, and when would we be voting for that representative?
Right, so the Census Act stipulates that the data collection process is completed by the Census Bureau and submitted to the president for his certification by December 31st. So that would be one day in which we would know, obviously the president takes some time to deliberate over these data and then certifies the census results. The Census Bureau itself does the apportionment calculations, and they will announce the number of congressional districts in each state. And then the state is permitted a degree of autonomy to redistrict as they see fit. So we should know, if everything holds to a timeline, early in 2021, the result of those apportionment calculations. Some of this may be thrown off by elements related to data collection and the COVID pandemic. That remains to be seen, but at least according to the text of the Census Act, that data has to be prepared by December 31st.
And under that scenario, then we would be using the new districts to vote in 2022.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. So let me go to a question for the commissioners for a moment. To Commissioner Essman, can you comment as a person who was previously in the legislature, how does the experience of having been elected from a district affect how you see the process of redistricting? because you were a person who had to then deal with however the districts were drawn when you were running for office?
Nancy, that's a great question. Initially I entered the Montana State Senate through appointment, and my experience was I was appointed to fill a vacancy that was created when the state senator that had the seat was elected lieutenant governor under Brian Schweitzer. The interesting thing was that was John Bollinger. I ran into John my first week up in the Montana Capitol, and we knew each other from both being in business and Billings, and he grabbed my shoulders and he said, do a good job in the district. He said, I never knocked on one door in that district. It was a quirk of the 2000 cycle that he was reassigned from representing a Senate district in the eastern part of Billings to representing a district in the western part of Billings that he had never run in. So that is an experience that I'll be bringing to the commission. I think in terms of fairness to the people, holdover senators should be reassigned to the district that most closely resembles their current district. I think their voters elected them, and they should serve those voters. That'll be my policy, and I hope the commission will, approve that.
Thank you. Question for Sheila Stearns. How has your previous service as higher education commissioner helped you to lead the commission?
Well, thank you for the question. I think so far we are just in the fact-finding learning phase. But I think as Commissioner of Higher Education, I dealt with presidents and universities that had a common goal that was good education for all students, and yet they were competitive, very much so. So it has that in common. There are turf issues. There were in higher education. So there were, good people, leaders who earnestly tried to do in every regential decision the fair thing and to use common sense. But I think I had to navigate that for 10 years. And I think that was probably a pretty good experience.
Thank you. And Commissioner Joe Lamson, you have actually served on this commission twice before, in the round in 2000 and the round in 2010. What can you say is new and different about where we are today from where we were in those other two redistricting sessions?
Besides the plague? So, no, quite seriously, I mean, we are in totally uncharted areas right now, and all the commission has recognized that, and the key is getting the people to participate in the census, because there's a whole realm of different things, and whether we get a second district or not, or whatever the situation is, but there's some real serious problems that were built into the infrastructure of the census for a rural state like Montana. Most states have 3% of their population gets their mail through a post office box or a rural route. The rest of them, it's a direct thing. Well, the census will only mail directly to house addresses. In Montana, that number is about 25%. So until August of this year, 25% of Montanans, and it's mostly situated in our rural communities and in our reservation communities, it was the first time they had heard of the census. Meanwhile, the census was geared up to hit the crescendo on April 1st, and we normally do it then. We never even got into the field of play out in those areas, and because of the way the pandemic is moving, especially in our reservation communities, they're under lockdown. It is very difficult to get people out there and do that. And so structurally, we are hurting in a big time. That has been compounded by the collapse of the of the extra time that the census had allocated for data gathering. Normally, it's a 6-month project. Our folks in Montana estimate now that under the current situation, it'll be about a 9-week gathering of data. And so by definition, we're going to miss a lot of people just because of that time. And that affects not only whether we get a second congressional seat, but also whether the legislative thing. I mean, if we don't count people correctly, all of a sudden, rather than having the best state in representing our American Indian citizens, which are represented in an exact proportion in the Senate and in the House, we could start falling into an area where we are totally out of whack with that, let alone our rural citizens out in those eastern Montana communities all of a sudden have, 4 or 5 less representatives at the Montana legislature putting their points of view first. I mean, and that's what we're dealing with there. So, I mean, that's a real one. And then very disappointingly, we have an administration that has politicized this census process. And I've been involved in census processes since the 1980s. And it's always been the highest integrity of any of the federal agencies in the protection of the data. This was started in 1790, and it's always been done with the utmost integrity. This census was tainted by the very, very beginning around the whole issues of race and partisanship that were thrown out by the U.S. Supreme Court. And then the second closing of these deadlines to collapse that is only going to hurt, rural states like Montana. So I think, unfortunately, I mean, if we didn't have all of this stuff there, I'd be delighted about this topic because, the biggest thing, I was a former staff member for Congressman Pat Williams for 14 years. I was a state director. So very involved in how you drew the east and western districts. And I was just delighted, and we went to the United States Supreme Court defending Montana's right to keep that second district and lost. And so the notion that we could reestablish Montana's rightful number of districts this time was going to be a pure delight. And I just don't know if that's going to happen. The other great news also that I was hoping to is the resources for the public participation, this webinar and those types of things, but also through projects like the mapping project. For the very first time, any citizen is going to be able to go online and have all the census data and all the relevant social and political data downloaded, and they can draw their own map and present ideas to the commission. And I welcome that. That's great. So anyway, I probably speak too long. Sorry.
So I have a question for Peter that then the rest of you can comment on also. Why would a north-south district map be laughed out of government?
Well, part of it is just, I think the historical tradition of an east-west division is such that anything that deviates from that pattern might be seen as something that needs to justify its own existence. It's also a question that we might imagine that the folks in the northwest of the state may be different in some way from the folks in the eastern prairie of the state, and they might not want to be drawn into the same districts. As I mentioned, these are just proposals and are designed just to demonstrate the sort of universe of possibilities rather than strictly say, push a button on a computer and say, here is the district. I think the public plays an important role, and even laughing at a bad plan provides important information to a commission because they can get a sense of what the people want in terms of the configuration of their electoral districts.
All righty. Yes, go ahead, Jeff.
Well, I might jump in. I think there's a couple of other policies that we need to consider when we draw these lines. If we want to have districts that are competitive and offer people a chance to pursue them and challenge an incumbent, we need to have districts that are efficient in terms of travel and efficient in terms of media markets, because you can we have a very diverse and uniquely diverse radio and TV market in the state of Montana versus most other states. And that can create, If you ignore that real world element completely, you can make it much more difficult for people to challenge an incumbents. And it's good for democracy that incumbents get challenged, regardless of the party they represent.
Thank you. So what would it mean if a county like Cascade was split in half for the purpose of congressional redistricting? And similarly, is it conceivable that a Native American reservation could be divided when Montana is divided into 2 districts?
I can take
No, I
that.
could.
Joe, please feel free.
Yeah, no, I would jump in there. I would think it would be just because of the, not
That's
my
funny.
dog, the configuration of where the populations and where the reservations. I would think it would be highly unlikely that a reservation would be divided. However, I think because of the strict requirements, I mean, basically, how we read the decisions out of the court is that, you know, we're going to have 1 million people and there's going to be 500,000 people at one side and there's going to be 500,001 people on the other side. And if it's much more than that, then somebody's got a ground for a suit. And so if you're going to hit that kind of position, I think it's going to be highly likely that some county along the way may, you know, split out some of their populations, and counties that have larger populations are, you know, more important in that, because what you're trying to do is get equal populations on both sides of the line. So,
Peter, did
Jeff?
you want to add anything to that?
No.
Okay, thank you. There is a question here that could we have more details about the Redistricting Commission? How are they appointed and how long do they serve? Who'd like to take that one? Go ahead.
I can
That's
jump
okay.
in there.
All righty.
The Montana Constitution specifies how we are appointed, and basically the Montana State Senate, the majority and minority leaders of each party appoint a member, and over in the House, the same. Then under the Constitution, the 4 meet and attempt to appoint a nonpartisan chair. If they fail to do that, the Montana Supreme Court, in its wisdom, picks an individual like they have this time in Commissioner Stearns. So that's how that process works.
And it's true, I think that you serve until the next census, is that right? Or just until the process of finishing?
No, I think we serve, we deliver our plan to the legislature. They get a comment on it. We can listen to their comments or choose to ignore them and make adjustments or not. We come to a conclusion. We certify that to the Supreme Court, to the Secretary of State, and then we're disbanded.
Okay.
yeah,
So
our Constitution is actually very eloquent, and I think the League may have had a little finger in this. It says that after we file the plan with the Secretary of State, we cease to exist. And as a commissioner, you've gone through this process for, you know, 3 or 4 years of your life, and all of a sudden you cease to exist. And I think that's just delightful.
So I have a question here. Maybe Peter, I'll throw this one to you. Is there any possibility that a second congressional seat in Montana would be assigned as an at-large seat, as was the case for that short period in our history? And would this be of any value?
No. The concept of at-large districts has been foreclosed by federal law, in part because other states were, say, less than small d democratic with how they deployed these additional seats. For example, there's still a section of Florida state law that says that in the event that Florida gains an additional seat in the US House, that is added to the district map as an at-large district. And this was seen as discriminatory toward minority populations and has been closed off as part of the reforms that were put in place in the 60s. At-large districts cannot exist any longer. US congressional districts are mandated to be single-member districts, meaning that one person is elected from each district.
Thank you. And then I have one more question here about metrics. Peter presented many metrics for redistricting fairness, the efficiency gap, the partisan bias, the mean median comparison, for example. Are there other measures that you would recommend or other factors that we should be measuring?
There are other academic measures that have been innovated. There's one delightful one, and I'm using delightful here as a sort of, as a scholar of redistricting, something that I get interested in, but probably the rest of the human race is probably not interested in. It's referred to as gradation, which if you plot the districts in order of and then you evaluate the angle from one district to the other, you can get a sense of the partisan bias. But I wouldn't suggest that this measure is say something that you want to dive into as an initial matter. And the good news is that it tends to line up with these other measures. I think the efficiency gap is intuitively pretty easy to grasp. It was, after all, designed with the intention of having a pretty easy approach to evaluating plans. That being said, I think my strongest preference is probably for the partisan symmetry measure, in the sense that that seems to be weighted to account for different states, different localities. You can even, as has been done in other studies, use partisan symmetry in other countries to evaluate the fairness of other electoral systems. So the idea that you have one measure that can be applied to more or less any political context indicates to me that it's a good measure that can be used universally.
Thank you. So how do voters get notified if they are redistricted? Anybody?
Jeff looks like, Jeff is in the
Hey,
middle.
Jeff.
Well, the mainly it is local, local news. I mean, hopefully there'll be stories about our process when it rolls forward, and I hope it will at some point. I can tell you as a guy who went door to door, most of the voters I encountered had not sat down and looked at the map of the legislative districts in my hometown of Billings, and frankly hadn't seen a candidate in 10 or 15 years. So it's going to be a local effort, and the candidates, of course, will educate them when they're going door to door, and I hope they are able to do that again in the next election.
Yes, Jeff's exactly right on that. That's how they learn, is a candidate knocking on the door and saying, "Hi, we're married. And, I'd like to be your representative, and let's talk." And so I think that adds some vigor to the system. So
I believe that the legislative website also will have a how to find your legislator function that will take you to a map that will help you sort out what's happened after the new districts have been accepted and approved. So anyone else failing all of their showing up on your doorstep, you can always go to the legislative website and find that out once the new maps have been posted. Thank you. Let's see. Do the members of the commission agree with Dr. Miller's assessment that with our likelihood of getting a second House seat?
This is Sheila. I think we are just as puzzled now because of the circumstances that Commissioner Lamson described, and a little more skeptical that we will qualify for a second seat than we might have been when Dr. Miller made his estimate. We're still hopeful, but a lot will depend on what transpires with Montana's census response in the next couple months. The final update, leave, door to door. And as you heard him describe, with our rural areas and some of the Native American areas locked down, it's a little, my guess is, and I'd like to hear from my fellow commissioners, it's a little less likely, slightly at least.
I'll comment. I hope the census makes up a lot of ground. I'm hoping that perhaps Congress is going to be back in session, I guess, at the end of the week here in DC. perhaps the Speaker of the House will relent to some of her members that want to broaden the scope of a bill that they might send to the Senate dealing with some issues. If that's the case, you know, certainly the census timeline could be part of that action, you know, but right now, you know, I've got a sick feeling in my stomach about where the census is at this point, and I'm not sure that we can look at the projections as a guarantee. I'm sure it's not guaranteed. The only guarantee is this process is going to go forward, hopefully to an end that is correct.
Yeah, I would agree with Jeff, and also thank Jeff, and under Sheila's leadership, we were able to put together a pretty unanimous coalition in Montana, bipartisan, with Senator Daines' office and Senator Tester's office, calling on, you know, the Mitch McConnell and the president to reestablish the timelines there, just so that we could at least have a fighting chance in this. And through Jeff and Commissioner Stusik's good work, it became a very bipartisan thing. We'd like to get a few more of our Republican colleagues to join on with the leadership of Senator Daines on this issue. Would be great. But you know, I mean, that's just real. Hopefully, there are some ways. Commissioner Kendra Miller and I had a very, I would consider, productive discussion with James Whitehorn, who is the top census person on redistricting and the Voting Rights Act, to see how our Montana data could potentially be augmented with existing federal databases. I mean, even though we haven't heard from people, we know from a variety of reasons that there's a check going to that particular residence. We know how many people are in that particular residence. There's a Department of Defense satellite that flies over the entire globe every day and takes a picture, and we see 2 pickups in the yard. You know, so there's ways to augment this thing that hopefully can happen. But the most important and the most easy thing is, like, if you filled out your census, you run it. I mean, the question that every Montana needs to be asking of everybody they run into in the next 2 months is, have you filled out the census form? And that's the best thing you can do for the state in so many reasons. So there.
Okay. Peter, did you want to weigh in on that one at all?
Just to say that there's a great degree of uncertainty, and that the estimates that are put together by Election Data Services are, of course, just one estimate. The leader of that firm, Kim Brace, has a long record in redistricting data management and sort of analysis. I trust his numbers, but the problem is, of course, the response rates and the quality of the data that come from the census this year are an open question. We can't fill in that black box at this moment.
Okay. Well, I have 2 more questions, and I will ask those, and then we'll need to wrap this up. My first question is, the majority of Montana legislative districts are known to be Democratic or Republican. Wouldn't more competitive legislative districts be better, and why aren't districts currently more competitive? Who'd like to take that one?
Well, I would argue that they are pretty competitive.
Oh, you're muted, Joe.
I would argue that they are actually pretty competitive if you look at them in a whole. They're one way to look at the competitiveness is like in the total makeup of the legislature, how many people cast a vote for a Republican candidate in the legislature, and what percentage of the people voted for a Democratic legislator, because that's basically how it breaks down. And if you look at the current plan in place, it has, banged in pretty darn close to within a percentage point or so of, like, the percentage of people that voted for a Democrat in there has been anywhere from 44 to 45%. And, we've banged around in those sort of low to mid 40s as a party there. And there, and that's what's been reflected in the legislature there. You know, it's so, you know, luckily parties are not, they're not straightforward, and they have different thoughts within them. And when you can bring the, I think here's where competitiveness comes in. If the district is more, I think, has a more diverse spectrum of opinions in it, those legislators tend to be problem solvers. They tend to be looking for different things that can get a good compromise. And that's why in the last session that over 20 Republican legislators would occasionally cross across the aisle to, put together a good package for the betterment of Montana, from my perspective. And I think that's what competitive districts do. And so, can we create more of them? I certainly hope so. I mean, I can speak for Commissioner Miller and I, that's our first priority, is to create as many competitive districts in Montana in this process as we possibly can.
Thank you.
I
Go ahead.
would like to comment a little bit. I am a little bit worried about whether all the districts are perceived as being competitive or are competitive. I mean, there are a number of, and there's quite a number of districts that, frankly, there's not going to be both parties on the ballot this fall. 7 in my county that I'm aware of this go around. So the question is competitive district the holy grail, or is districts that constitute a community of interest for that legislator, is that community of interest the highest goal? And of course, these are things that the commission will be discussing as we go forward, and the public will have its opportunity to weigh in and advise us. And yeah. I hope we have the opportunity to have meetings with people that in attendance before this process concludes.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the hard numbers of it, about 80 of the 100 districts, because of where Montanans live, we are a state that's just a little smaller than California, but we have 1 million people, 1/40th of the population spread over vast areas. And so just because of that function of that geography and where people are, you can't create, there's no way you could create 100 competitive districts. But what the notion is out of that 8, can we get 20 competitive districts back and forth, and have the remaining 80 basically representative of the proportions of either party's presence in those areas? I mean, I've lived in Montana for 45 years. I have trouble in Carter County. I just can't get my message out there. And likewise, there's similar there. But, the notion, I think, is to maximize the areas that you can make a difference. And that's where I think we work out solutions that are best for Montana.
Okay, thank you. I have a comment here I would like to share with everyone. As we know, the Brennan Center is a national organization, and we have a number of people who are observing this webinar today who are from the national front. And one of them is Kim Brace, who is the president of Election Data Services. Kim wanted to just share with all of us this following comment. Our studies show Montana would gain the second seat by only 2,402 people to spare, one of the closest margins for several decades. New estimates for 2020 still shows the state gaining a second seat, but now by 9,204 people to spare. But both of these are dependent upon how well the count is taken, and we're seeing there's a great problem there. It will also depend upon the president's desire to exclude non-citizens. We are very much in a guessing game now, so there is no guarantee for Montana quite yet. So I just thought I'd throw that in. My final question I would like to offer to the commission is, do you have plans for public meetings or hearings going forward? And if so, can you tell us at what point those might occur and where in the process we are right now and where would those happen?
Nancy, I'll take that to start with. Before all this broke, or in June as we discussed it, we thought we would like to have some hearings in the fall about our criteria, as they have done 10 years ago and probably more. We are, of course, much less certain now that those can be in person. So probably, we don't know this, we will get together again for our next meeting in September or so and begin to plan our calendar for hearings. We have not decided if they can be in person, but it seems our goal will be to have as much public involvement as easy as possible for people and sites around the state, as has been our pattern, but that is evolving. We do hope to, have at least one of our scenarios, to have our criteria and kind of the rest of our planning done by, before the state legislature resumes and before even we get the data. So we have some work to do this fall, and we are committed to public involvement, but the nature of that public involvement remains, and the exact timing remains a little uncertain.
Okay. Well, I would just like to add that anyone who's interested in tracking when that might come up, that you do have a website as part of the Montana legislature under their committees. You can go under committees and go down to other and go into other, and there you have the Redistricting Commission, and you can get to the website that way. So people can track going forward what it is you're doing and how to get in touch with what's happening. Well, and with this, I would like to draw this evening to a close. Our thanks to Dr. Peter Miller from the Brennan Center for Justice and for the partnership with the Brennan Center in being able to help make this program possible. Thank you so much. We're also grateful to the members of the Montana Districting and Apportionment Commission who are with us this evening, Commissioner Jeff Essman, Joe Lamson, who I believe just lost his connection and fell off the screen here. Maybe he'll be back. There he is. Thank you, Joe, for being here this evening. And Chairperson Sheila Stearns for your presence as well. And also thank you to all of those of you who came in as attendees and were so enthusiastic in your participation and sending in questions. Thank you so much. A video recording of this program will be posted on the websites of the Montana League of Women Voters, on the website of the Montana Districting and Apportionment Commission, and it will also be available on the Brennan Center YouTube station channel. So you can spread the word to all those folks that weren't able to be here tonight. It will be out there for the duration so people can get this information if they would like it. Just a few notes from the League of Women Voters and the Brennan Center to bolster our democracy before we leave you. First one, as we've been saying over and over tonight, if you haven't already, please go complete your census form. You can do it online at my2020census.gov. It's quick and it's the most efficient way to get the census done despite the challenges of COVID. And tell everyone you know that they need to be counted by September 30th, 2020, as it stands right now. Montana's future depends on it. If you're planning to vote in Montana, you can check your voter registration now by going to the My Voter page on the Montana Secretary of State's website. You can check your mailing address, you can check whether you are signed up for an absentee ballot, and if not, you can download a vote by mail absentee voter request form to send in. You can also, if you're not registered to vote, you can download a voter registration form there as well. And if you don't live in Montana and you can't vote by mail or participate in early voting in your state, call your local members of Congress and let them know that you want those options to vote safely. I am Nancy Leifer from the League of Women Voters, Montana. Thank you all for coming and supporting the work of the League of Women Voters and the Brennan Center for Justice. Good night.